Okay, let's unpack this. We have received, I mean, just an epic stack of sources asking us to perform a truly comprehensive analysis of age gaps in relationships.
Yeah,
And I mean, comprehensive, we're talking about statistics, legal thresholds, evolutionary pressures, and all the way back to, well, deep pre-modern theological dogma.
that's right. Our mission today is to navigate these wildly disparate frameworks. We're moving beyond just the statistical stuff, which tells us what's normal today,
Right.
And we're going into the ideological. And specifically, we will be diving deep into traditional Catholic doctrine, primarily pre-1958. This system provides, well, it gives us the most rigorous, systematic, and frankly, in many ways, kind of shocking ideological counterpoint to modern secular standards about partnership.
It's fascinating because our sources give us pretty clear legal, psychological, even historical standards for what makes an age difference, problematic.
Mm-hmm.
But the moment you introduce the concept of divine law, the whole framework just explodes, doesn't it?
It really does. Because the core concern across every modern framework, you look at the psychological, the legal, the feminist view, it's all about power imbalance, potential coercion, and genuine consent.
Yeah.
And large age gaps, they're immediately suspected as places where that imbalance just inherently exists. But where modernity finds scandal, traditional theology often found, well, necessary, divine order. It's a complete flip.
So we are going to look at the hard numbers, the incredible case study of the Holy Family, which is just mind-blowing when you look at the numbers, and the really complex theological definition of the conjugal bond, this profound concept of one flesh.
Exactly. Where do we start? The modern landscape.
Let's start with where most people live. Section 1, the comparative landscape.
Yeah.
We need context for what's considered, statistically normal before we get into the exceptions. Okay, so when we look at global statistics for modern heterosexual relationships, the average age difference is actually quite modest. We're talking about 2 to 4 years, usually with the man being older.
Right. That's the statistical median you see pretty consistently.
But this average isn't just random, is it? It seems like it's a kind of sociological and maybe biological compromise.
Absolutely. That 2-4 year gap isn't just a median. It's kind of a sweet spot. It's defined by mild evolutionary preference, you could say, and just social practicality.
How so?
Well, it provides maybe enough resource stability, the man being slightly older, perhaps more established, without creating these massive life stage gaps or misalignments.
Yeah, like that.
It's basically the comfort zone for, well, nearly all modern social and psychological frameworks.
But comfort zones are boring. You're here to talk about the edges, right?
Exactly.
The sources show things start getting, let's say, complex when we talk about large gaps. And they usually define that as 10 years or more.
Right. Large gaps are a clear deviation from that norm. They happen in only about 8% of heterosexual couples in Western society. So not that common.
Okay.
But here's a fascinating data point our sources really highlight. In same-sex unions, that number jumps way up. Yeah, 25% in male-male unions and 15% in female-female unions have gaps of 10 years or more.
Wow, that is a huge disparity.
Yeah.
25% versus 8%.
It's significant.
So if the, let's say, traditional cultural gender dynamic is removed or altered, the pressure for people to be closer in age seems to drop quite dramatically.
That's a key inference, yeah. It suggests that maybe the fear of the age gap in heterosexual unions is deeply tied up with the fear of, patriarchal power dynamics.
Interesting.
But regardless of orientation, scrutiny seems to begin at certain numerical thresholds. And these are crucial for you, the listener, to grasp, I think. Our sources basically synthesize 3 major areas that trigger immediate red flags across most social and psychological ways of thinking today.
Okay, what's the first danger zone? It involves youth, right?
Yes. Concern pops up when the younger partner is under 25 and the gap is more than 10 years.
Okay, why that combination? Under 25 and over 10 years.
Well, it combines the sort of immaturity factor, or maybe developmental factors better, with the gap factor. Age 25 is often used as this rough psychological marker for when the prefrontal cortex finishes developing, full emotional maturity, impulse control, that kind of thing.
Right.
So when someone significantly older gets into a relationship with someone still in that very formative stage, the power differential, just in terms of emotional experience, financial resources, social standing, it's potentially massive.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second threshold?
Second, the sheer scale of the difference matters. So concern is expressed if the gap is more than 20 years, pretty much regardless of the ages of the partners.
Even if both are, say, middle-aged,
Yeah.
like 40 and 60.
Yeah, even then, because a 20-year gap just creates inherent life stage incompatibility, or at least challenges. Think about it. When one person is maybe thinking about retiring, the other is at their professional peak.
Or one's worrying about college applications for kids, the other's worrying about elderly parents.
Exactly. That divergence creates these predictable stress points. And often it hinges on one partner having to kind of sacrifice their life stage priorities for the other.
Huh, okay. And the third danger zone isn't actually a number.
Right. It's more about a pattern. Suspicion arises if the older partner exclusively seems to seek out much younger partners, like it's their only type.
Why is that seen as a red flag?
Well, that pattern is often interpreted as maybe a preference for vulnerability. It suggests the older person might be specifically looking for a partner with less experience, maybe fewer established boundaries, perhaps greater sort of malleability or even financial dependence.
So it points towards a potential control issue.
Potentially, yeah. Even if the specific relationship seems healthy on the surface, the pattern itself raises questions about the motivation.
Okay, so moving from social suspicion to legal reality. Most Western places set the age of consent around 16 to 18, right? That's the baseline for legal capacity.
Yes, and that boundary is usually pretty firm. However, you do see the legal system sometimes trying to inject a bit of nuance through what they call Romeo and Juliet exceptions.
Right, I've heard of those.
Yeah, they sometimes allow maybe a 2 to 4 year difference when both partners are technically minors. It's sort of an acknowledgement that the law should maybe try to distinguish between, genuine teenage romance and actual statutory predation.
But once both people are legally adults, large age gaps are totally fine, legally speaking.
Correct. Completely permissible.
But you mentioned earlier that the law doesn't just stop caring entirely about the disparity. How does that show up later?
It mainly shows up in situations of dispute or, well, death, for instance, in custody battles. Courts might question the long-term stability and maybe the role modeling provided by an extremely older parent, especially if the difference is, say, 25 or 30 years.
The judge has to think about the child's future.
Exactly. And similarly, in inheritance disputes, if wills get changed late in life, a huge age gap can definitely heighten suspicion of what's called undue influence.
Suggesting the younger partner maybe coerced the older one.
Precisely. Suggesting the much younger partner might have pressured the older, maybe ailing partner into changing legal documents. So the legality of the relationship itself doesn't shield it from scrutiny when things go wrong later.
Gotcha. That brings us to the psychological view. And interestingly, psychology seems less concerned with the average number and more about what's actually happening inside the relationship.
Yeah, the psychological perspective shifts the focus almost entirely to internal dynamics. Things like compatibility, emotional maturity, shared values, communication.
So the gap itself isn't the main issue.
Not inherently, no. Studies show that a gap of, say, 5 to 10 years can introduce challenges, maybe different cultural references, different energy levels, maybe one partner feeling intellectually superior or something.
Sure.
But the success of the relationship, overwhelmingly, it's determined by communication, mutual respect, and a genuine willingness to negotiate those life stage differences. Psychology really values equity in the emotional power structure more than anything else.
Okay, now let's explore the ideological critiques. Because this is where the why behind all the scrutiny gets really, well, political. The first and probably most influential critique comes from the feminist standard, right?
Yeah, the feminist critique tends to view the older male, younger female dynamic as fundamentally problematic, or at least potentially problematic. It often frames these gaps as structural,
Structural in what way?
reflecting patriarchal dominance and potentially male control over female youth, fertility, and economic independence. The fear isn't just that coercion might happen, but that the very structure of that age gap enables it more easily.
And the practical limit where suspicion starts is actually quite low in this view. They mention gaps bigger than 5 years when the woman is under 25.
Right. That reflects the concern that if power, economic independence, and life experience are already skewed, adding a significant age factor on top of that makes free and equal negotiation almost impossible for the younger woman.
Which sounds like an economic critique too, but you're saying it's distinct from the Marxist standard.
It is distinct, yeah. The communist or Marxist framework looks at the age gap through the lens of pure social and economic inequality. The core idea there is that relationships can become transactions.
Like older, wealthy men exploiting younger, economically dependent women.
Exactly. Wealth and status being exchanged for youth and beauty, which then reinforces class divisions. It's seen as part of the capitalist structure of exploitation.
So the ideal for them would be partners close in age, where there's no disparity in, like, productivity or economic leverage.
Pretty much. The relationship should serve the collective welfare, not just be about private advantage or inheritance.
Okay, this transition is crucial now because we're moving from frameworks that critique power imbalances
Right.
to one that actually interprets a specific kind of imbalance,
Ooh.
the patriarchal standard.
Yeah, this is a complete 180-degree turn. Historically, the patriarchal standard didn't just tolerate large age gaps, it often actively promoted them, typically 10 to 15 years, with the male always being the older one.
And this was seen as the ideal functional arrangement for, what, stability?
Exactly, for stability. The functionality was seen as quite simple. Align the female peak for fertility and beauty, cited in the sources as roughly 1825, with the male peak for status, established resources, and experience, usually in his 30s or 40s.
So the man enters the marriage already prepared to be the provider and protector.
Correct. Reinforcing his role as the established authority, the head of the household, the age gap facilitated that structure.
Okay, before we jump headfirst into theology, let's just briefly touch on biology. The evolutionary perspective offers a pretty clean explanation for why these gaps might exist naturally, right?
Yeah, evolutionarily speaking, the underlying goal is maximizing reproductive fitness. So men tend to prefer younger partners, usually cited as 5 to 10 years younger, because youth is the strongest visual cue for peak fertility.
And women.
Women, conversely, tend to favor men who are maybe 2 to 8 years older. Why? Because older men generally signal stability, establish social status, resources, and the proven ability to protect and provide for offspring successfully. It's about resource security.
And just quickly, the rare historical inversion of this, the matriarchal or matrifocal view, what does that show us?
It shows what happens when women control the resources or the lineage. While pure matriarchies are debated historically in systems where women control property or descent is traced through the female line, they gain significant autonomy in mate selection.
So they might choose differently.
Exactly. In some rare historical examples, the sources mention women might choose a younger, more physically vigorous mate, maybe 5 to 10 years her junior. In that case, she's choosing perhaps for fertility or physical capability because her own lineage or resources handle the provisioning side. It's basically an inversion of the typical patriarchal resource exchange.
Okay, so we've established the statistical norms, the economic critiques, the biological drivers, most of which generally frown upon large age gaps, seeing them as unusual or potentially risky.
Right.
Now, we have to shift gears completely. We need to transition to a system where a large age gap isn't just anomalous, but potentially accepted, maybe even seen as essential because of divine decree.
This is the essential pivot, and here's where it gets really interesting and honestly quite challenging for modern minds. How do these modern secular frameworks we've just discussed apply to the ages of the Holy Family, Mary and Joseph, at the time of their marriage, according to traditional Catholic sources?
Because this union seems to challenge every single modern standard we just laid out.
Every single one. But first, we have to be clear, the Church doesn't have a dogma on their specific ages, so there's room for historical interpretation based on tradition.
Okay.
And the sources present two dominant historical traditions, or escamations. Each one serves a slightly different theological purpose, especially related to the really key doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity.
Let's start with the tradition that probably creates the most modern shock value, the elderly Joseph tradition.
Right. This is the view that really dominated artistic depictions and popular piety for centuries, often drawing from apocryphal texts like the Proto-Evangelium of James.
And what ages does it propose?
It generally holds that Mary was incredibly young, probably 12 to 15 years old, which was, a standard age for a girl's betrothal in first century Judea.
Okay. Young, but historically plausible for the time.
Right. But Joseph, crucially, was consistently portrayed not just as older, but as an elderly widower. Some traditions cite him as being 80 or even 90 years old.
Wait, 80 or 90? With Mary at 12 to 15.
Yeah.
So if Mary is, say, 14 and Joseph is 80, we're looking at an age gap of 66 years.
Potentially, yes. That number just blows away every modern metric we just talked about.
How on earth did the church fathers or theologians rationalize a gap that enormous? What was the thinking?
The rationale was twofold, and it was purely functional for protecting dogma. First, a practical point. Joseph's advanced age neatly explained his disappearance from the scripture narrative later on. He likely declared relatively early in Jesus' life.
Okay, that makes narrative sense.
But the crucial theological reason was safeguarding Mary's perpetual virginity. Her status as semper virgo, always a virgin, before, during, and after Christ's birth.
Ah, so the age gap itself became a kind of theological guarantee.
Exactly. The union was framed entirely as protective guardianship, not a carnal marriage in the typical sense. His extreme age was seen as eliminating any conceivable biological possibility that they had or could ever have sexual relations.
So it physically underscored her virginity.
Right. It made her status as Semper Virgo seem physically undeniable, sidestepping the potentially awkward theological question of why the earthly parents of Christ might not have consummated their marriage if Joseph were younger and capable.
Okay, so the age gap serves a very specific doctrinal purpose here. It's not presented as a model for ordinary human marriage at all.
Absolutely not. It's theological necessity. But you mentioned there was a second, less extreme tradition.
Yes, what about that one?
That's the younger Joseph tradition. This is more of a minority view, historically speaking, often supported by later mystics and private revelations. For example, Venerable Mary of Agreda, a 17th century Spanish mystic, wrote in detail about the life of Mary.
And what ages did she suggest?
She placed Mary around 13 or 14, still very young, but Joseph around 33 years old at the time of their marriage.
Okay, 33 and 14. That's still a 19-year gap. Very significant by modern standards, especially with a partner who is legally a minor today,
Definitely still significant.
but worlds away from the 66-year difference.
Absolutely. The rationale here prioritized a different set of virtues for Joseph. He was still seen as mature, established, and deeply virtuous, certainly capable of protecting the Holy Family, which was essential for things like the flight into Egypt. But he was also young enough to be a vigorous carpenter, a provider through labor. And importantly, his relative youth meant his commitment to chastity within the marriage was seen as a conscious, heroic, virtuous sacrifice, rather than simply a biological inevitability due to old age.
So one tradition emphasizes Joseph's age to guarantee Mary's virginity physically. The other emphasizes his virtue in upholding it despite being younger.
Precisely. Both traditions serve to protect the core Marian doctrines, just through different lenses on Joseph's age and character.
Okay, let's apply our modern lens to both of these traditions now, because the contrast is incredibly stark, and it immediately highlights why modern secular standards and this traditional view just cannot coexist peacefully.
Yeah, the clash is immediate. By basically every contemporary framework we discussed, legal, psychological, ethical, both traditions would be classified as illegal child marriage today.
The elderly Joseph tradition especially. A 14-year-old girl with an 80-year-old man.
That would trigger every single psychological and statutory red flag imaginable. It's the textbook definition of vulnerability and extreme power imbalance in modern terms. It would likely face statutory charges in most Western countries today.
And even the younger Joseph tradition, the 19-year gap, with a man over 30 and a girl under the modern age of consent.
Still deeply problematic by today's standards. It would certainly attract scrutiny from social services and legal bodies, even if technically legal in some specific historical contexts.
And if we apply the feminist critique we talked about earlier,
From that perspective, this entire case study, particularly the elderly Joseph version, is often seen as the ultimate, almost archetypal example of patriarchal control.
how so?
Well, some feminist sources argue that the traditional narrative of the elderly, non-threatening Joseph was deliberately constructed or emphasized by male theologians precisely to control, desexualize, and neutralize the feminine archetype, Mary, ensuring her virginity fit neatly within the male theological agenda and posed no challenge to it.
Wow. Okay, so given all this modern condemnation, legal, psychological, feminist, how does the traditional Catholic justification hold up internally? They can't possibly present either of these traditions as a model for marriage today, can they?
No, absolutely not, and that's the crucial nuance that often gets missed. The traditional justification relies entirely on theological exceptionalism.
Meaning it's a special case.
Exactly. They argue that the union of Mary and Joseph is descriptive. It describes a unique, sacred event in salvation history governed by direct divine election and purpose. It is not prescriptive as a model for ordinary modern marriage.
So how is it defended then?
It's only defensible within their framework through three filters. First, divine purpose. God ordained it this way for salvation. Second, the nature of the marriage itself. It was a virginal marriage focused on guardianship, not a typical sexual union. And third, cultural relativism, judging it by first-century Judean norms, where early betrothal for girls was common practice, not by 21st century standards.
So the Holy Family's age gap isn't a marriage model. It's a unique theological construct necessitated by doctrine.
Precisely. And this is the pivot point for our entire deep dive today. If the traditional Catholic framework could not only accommodate but rationalize such massive age disparities rooted in functional doctrinal necessity, it's because their fundamental definition of what marriage is was radically different from ours.
Right. To tolerate a potential 66-year age gap, the roles, the purpose, the very reality of the marriage bond must transcend individual feelings, compatibility, or modern notions of consent entirely.
Absolutely. Which means we now have to dive into the actual structure that made that kind of arrangement seem not just possible, but potentially divinely ordered. Let's move to Section 3. The traditional Catholic blueprint for marriage, specifically pre-1958. Okay, the foundation of this entire system is the very clear, very rigid definition of the sacrament of matrimony. This was codified in the 1917 Code of Canon Law and spelled out in detail in major papal encyclicals, most famously Pope Pius X's Casti Connubii from 1930.
And marriage had essential properties, right?
Yeah. Yes, two essential properties. Unity, meaning one man, one woman, and indissolubility, meaning it lasts until death, unbreakable by human power. And crucially, its ends, its purposes, were strictly hierarchical.
This hierarchy is critical, isn't it? Because it immediately subordinates things that we moderns tend to think are the most important parts of marriage.
Exactly.
So what was the absolute primary end, the main reason marriage existed in this view?
The primary end, without question, was the procreation, proles, and the subsequent education of children. That was the objective purpose for which God instituted marriage. If you remove that primary purpose, you fundamentally misunderstand the entire traditional structure.
Okay, procreation first. And what were the secondary ends, the ones that were subordinate to having and raising children?
The secondary ends were subordinate, but still seen as important and necessary parts of the marriage. These were mutual aid and companionship, supporting each other, and the remedy for concupiscence, remedium concupiscentiae.
We need to unpack that last one for listeners. Remedy for concupiscence. What does that mean in this specific theological context? It sounds a bit clinical.
It does sound clinical. Concupiscence, theologically, is the inclination towards sin that arises from disordered desire. Basically, temptation, especially sexual temptation, stemming from original sin.
Okay.
So the marriage bond provided a legitimate, divinely sanctioned outlet for sexual desire within the marriage. This meant the sexual relationship, while always needing to be open to the primary end, procreation, also served this secondary purpose of helping the spouses avoid sins of impurity outside of marriage. It channeled natural desires appropriately.
So the key insight here is that companionship, mutual support, even romantic love, while certainly hoped for and considered goods of marriage,
Yes.
they were explicitly secondary goals. The primary objective purpose was generative, maximizing the creation of new souls and ensuring their proper education in the Catholic faith.
Exactly. And the entire structure of roles within the marriage, particularly the strict hierarchical authority, flowed directly from the perceived need to facilitate that primary end as effectively as possible.
Like to raise a large family in what was often a difficult world, they believed you needed a very clear, undisputed chain of command.
Precisely. You needed a clear authority structure, which brings us directly to the role of the husband.
The husband, defined as the patriarch and the head of the family.
Yes. He was seen to exercise patria potestas, which is Latin for paternal authority. This wasn't just a social role. It was understood as reflecting Christ's own headship over the church, drawing explicitly from St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians chapter 5, verse 23.
And the family itself was seen as a sort of miniature church.
Exactly, the domestic church. And the husband was the visible representative of God's authority within that small society. His authority wasn't derived from himself, but delegated by God.
Okay, so what were his primary responsibilities under this model? The sources list 3 key areas.
Right. First, and arguably foremost in the pre-1958 emphasis, was spiritual leadership. He was mandated, not just encouraged, to lead family prayers. The daily rosary was often considered practically mandatory in devout families. He had to ensure the family attended Mass, and he was the ultimate authority on teaching the faith to the children. His spiritual vigilance was seen as defining the sanctity of the entire home.
Okay, spiritual head. Second, the material side, provider and protector.
Absolutely. He was expected to be the sole, or at least the primary breadwinner. The ideal, which you see emphasized repeatedly in papal documents and sermons of the era, was that the wife and children should not have to work outside the home.
Why was that ideal so strong?
Because the mother's place was seen as exclusively in the home, focused on child rearing and domestic duties. The husband's mission was to provide the material security and physical defense that allowed her to fulfill that role without distraction or necessity forcing her out.
Okay, and the third primary responsibility, governance, final authority and decisions.
Yes. He held the final say in all significant family decisions. Things like major financial investments, deciding where the family would live, the type of education the children would receive, even large purchases.
Could the wife advise?
Oh, absolutely. She could advise, and a wise husband was expected to listen to her counsel intelligently. But the sources, especially the moral theology manuals and canon law commentaries, are crystal clear. After a consultation, the husband decides. His authority was real and final, not merely symbolic.
Now, that sounds like a recipe for potential tyranny. Given that absolute authority structure, how did the theology try to prevent that authority from becoming abusive in practice? Was there an inherent theological check or balance?
That's the essential internal question, and the system did have a built-in theological safeguard, at least in theory. The safeguard was the definition of Christ-like headship.
How was that defined?
The husband's authority was strictly mandated by the very theology that granted it to be exercised with sacrificial love. It had to mirror Christ giving himself up completely for the church, his bride.
So headship meant service, not domination.
Ideally, yes. Authority had to be rational, gentle, firm when necessary, but always directed towards the true spiritual and material good of the family, even if it meant personal inconvenience, suffering, or sacrifice for the husband himself. If he acted tyrannically, selfishly, or cruelly, he wasn't just being a bad husband. He was failing in his divinely appointed duty and committing serious sin, even though his canonical authority might technically remain intact.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. Which brings us to the wife's role, defined almost entirely by complementarity and, frankly, submission to that headship.
Her vocation was defined as the helpmate, drawing from Genesis 2.18, a helper fit for him, and the heart of the home. Her role was explicitly subordinate and complementary to the husband's authority.
Did that mean she had less dignity?
No, the theology insisted her dignity as a person, her ontological dignity, was absolutely equal to his. They were both made in God's image. But her function within the marriage and family structure was one of necessary subjection, reflecting what they saw as the divinely ordered structure of the universe, mirroring the church's submission to Christ.
So her primary duty, flowing from this, was submission and obedience.
Yes. This was defined not as grudging compliance, but ideally as a willing, even cheerful subordination to the husband's legitimate authority. She was expected to seek his permission for significant actions, especially those involving finances or leaving the home for extended periods.
And this obedience was framed positively.
It was framed as ordered love, a participation in God's divine order which brings peace. The idea was that submission maintained harmony and order within the domestic church. She could, and indeed must, only refuse a command if obeying it would require her to commit a sin. Otherwise, even if she disagreed with his rational decisions, obedience was expected.
Okay. Second, the absolutely central vocation, motherhood.
This was viewed as the primary and essential purpose of a woman's existence within this framework. Bearing children and then educating them in the faith and virtues was considered her sacred duty and highest calling.
And this linked directly to the condemnation of contraception.
Absolutely. As many children as God sends was the ideal. Contraception, which we'll discuss more under One Flesh, was considered a mortal sin precisely because it directly attacked and frustrated this primary end of marriage and her specific maternal vocation. This role also involved the incredibly demanding physical care of infants and the primary education of young children in basic prayers, catechism, and manners.
Her sphere was domestic management. She was called the Queen of the Home. Let's pause here. What did that title, Queen of the Home, actually entail in the pre-1958 practical reality? It sounds nice, but the workload must have been immense.
Immense is an understatement. Queen signified her authority within the domestic sphere, but the sources make clear her responsibilities were staggering, especially before widespread modern appliances. We're talking about providing 3 meals a day, often from scratch, all the cleaning, laundry, often by hand, mending, sewing clothes, food preservation like canning and pickling, managing the entire household budget, usually under the husband's oversight and with funds he provided.
So managing a self-sustaining microeconomy, essentially.
Pretty much, and all while potentially being pregnant or nursing much of the time. Her job was to create an orderly, peaceful, pious sanctuary, the Ecclesia Domestica, where her husband could find refuge from the world and where the children could be properly formed. The labor was constant and physically exhaustive.
And then there was the duty related specifically to the physical marital union, rendering the marriage dead.
Yes, this was the canonical and moral term for the wife's duty, and it was mirrored by the husband's duty to her to consent to marital relations when the other spouse reasonably initiated.
Where did this idea come from?
It cited St. Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 7, verses 3 through 5, which states that the husband should give to his wife what is due her, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does.
So refusal wasn't really an option.
Refusal without a grave, cause-like serious illness, immediate danger from childbirth, or perhaps if the husband was drunk or abusive at that moment, was considered a sin. Why? Because it denied the spouse their legitimate remedy for concupiscence, potentially placing them in the near occasion of sin, temptation. And crucially, every single act had to remain open to procreation.
And just briefly, how did children fit into this strict structure, their duties?
Children's duties were simple and absolute, immediate, cheerful obedience to both parents, but especially recognizing the father's final authority. They owed their parents honor and respect. Discipline was viewed not primarily as punishment, but as an act of charity necessary for forming virtue and saving their souls.
And corporal punishment.
Explicitly endorsed and expected, often citing the biblical proverb, "Spare the rod, spoil the child." The father typically took the lead in disciplining older children, especially sons, teaching them masculine virtues and overseeing vocational training or education. The mother primarily trained the daughters in the domestic arts, piety, and modesty, often prioritizing these overextensive academic pursuits for girls.
Okay, this entire incredibly rigid system, the tolerance for potentially huge age gaps in the Holy Family's case, the absolute headship of the husband, the fixed duties, the emphasis on procreation above all else, it only really makes sense logically if the marriage bond itself is understood as something far more profound than just a contract between two people.
Exactly. It has to be seen as a deep metaphysical reality, which brings us right to the ontological core of the whole system.
Right, the doctrine that underpins everything we've just described. One flesh, or una caro in Latin.
Yes. If you believe marriage is just a mutable social contract, adjustable by human will, then these rules seem arbitrary, even cruel. But if you believe, as this tradition did, that the marriage bond is an objective reality established by God that fundamentally alters the very being of the two spouses, then the rules, however difficult, become logically necessary consequences of that reality. So in this pre-1958 theology, una caro is absolutely not just a nice metaphor for closeness. It's understood as an ontological, metaphysical reality. It's something real, created by God through the sacrament.
How does it come into being?
It begins with the valid exchange of consent between the man and woman. That act creates the vinculum matrimoniae, the invisible but real marriage bond. But it is the consummation, the first complete, natural sexual act after the consent that perfects the bond, making it intrinsically indissoluble by any human power. Not even the Pope could dissolve a ratified and consummated sacramental marriage.
So the physical act has a sacramental power.
It does. That act of becoming one flesh is seen as creating a new, unified conjugal entity. It's a reality that, once fully formed, simply cannot be undone by human will, only by death.
And the foundation for this is scriptural, going way back.
Way back, rooted right in Genesis 2.24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Christ himself reaffirms this in Matthew 19.6, adding the crucial line, "So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate."
And St. Paul takes it even further.
Yes, St. Paul elevates it to a mystical level in Ephesians 5.32. He calls marriage the great sacrament or great mystery, sacramentum magnum in the Latin Vulgate, precisely because this one flesh union prefigures or is an image of the profound union between Christ and his church.
Okay. And the great theologian St. Augustine condensed the sacramental reality into what are called the three theological goods, or bona, of marriage. These define the purpose and nature of the bond.
Right. Those three goods are essential to understanding the traditional view. They are fides, faithfulness or fidelity, meaning exclusivity; proles, offspring, the orientation toward procreation; and sacramentum, the sacrament itself, signifying indissolubility and permanence.
And the idea was, if you intentionally remove or attack any one of these three goods,
You fundamentally destroy the integrity of the Unicaro union. You violate the marriage itself. This is why lifelong fidelity and permanence were seen as absolutely essential not just for the couple, but for the stability of society as a whole.
furthermore, canon law cemented this theological reality into a juridical bond. It wasn't just theology, it was law.
Exactly. The 1917 Code of Canon Law explicitly affirmed the perpetual and exclusive nature of the marriage bond, legally recognizing the couple as not two, but one before God and the Church. This legal unification established specific mutual rights and duties, like the reciprocal duty to render the marriage debt we discussed, which were, in theory, enforceable by the Church and often had implications in secular law as well, especially in Catholic countries.
Okay, so given this profound metaphysical and legal commitment to the absolute integrity of the Unicaro union,
Yeah.
it follows that the gravest sin within marriage had to be any act that deliberately attempted to violate or frustrate that God-given integrity.
Unquestionably.
And that leads us directly back to the very strong condemnation of contraception.
Absolutely. Pope Pius XI, in Casti Connubii in 1930, condemned any use of contraception within marriage as intrinsically evil, a mortal sin. Why? Because it directly attacks the proles, the procreative good, and thus violates the very definition of the Unicaro union and the integrity of the marital act itself.
What was the detailed theological logic behind that condemnation? It wasn't just an arbitrary thou shalt not, right? There was a specific reasoning.
The logic was rooted firmly in natural law philosophy, heavily influenced by Aquinas. The core argument is that God designed the sexual act to have two inseparable meanings or ends. The unitive, expressing love and bonding the spouses, and the procreative, being open to the transmission of life.
Inseparable.
Yes, inseparably linked in the design of the act itself. Contraception, by its very nature, deliberately and willfully separates those two inherent meanings. It seeks the unitive aspect, or perhaps just the pleasure, while actively blocking the procreative aspect.
And theologically, this was seen as, what, like an incomplete gift?
Exactly. It was viewed as an incomplete self-gift. You are physically uniting with your spouse, but you are intentionally holding back a fundamental part of yourself, your fertility, the potential to co-create life with God.
So it wasn't a total giving of self to the other.
Correct. It was seen as withholding the generative power that gives the act its full meaning and purpose within the divine order established at creation. Furthermore, it was argued that this instrumentalizes the act, potentially reducing the spouse to an object for pleasure rather than fully affirming them as a person and potential co-creator.
And this logical rigidity, this insistence on the inseparability of the unitive and procreative, extended even further, didn't it? It applied to non-procreative sexual acts, even within the marital embrace itself.
It did. The standard pre-1958 manuals of moral theology, used for training priests, consistently condemned non-procreative sexual acts, such as oral or anal sex, as gravely sinful, often categorizing them as acts against nature, actus contra naturam, even when performed between a validly married husband and wife.
The reasoning was the same.
The reasoning was identical. These acts were seen as intrinsically violating the natural law because they sought sexual pleasure while deliberately frustrating the sexual faculty's proper biological and theological end, which is procreation within the context of the vagina. Therefore, the pleasure derived was considered disordered. Sexual pleasure itself was permitted, even seen as good, but only when it was connected to an act that was naturally ordered towards procreation.
Wow, this level of moral scrutiny over the intimate details of marital life seems almost, well, suffocating to modern sensibilities.
It's certainly very different from contemporary views on sexual freedom and expression, even within marriage.
But there was one loophole, wasn't there? Or perhaps not a loophole, but one form of family spacing that was maybe grudgingly permitted. Natural family planning, NFP, specifically the rhythm method back then.
It was permitted, yes, but with very strict constraints and considerable suspicion from many moralists. It was allowed primarily because it utilized the woman's naturally occurring infertile periods. It didn't involve introducing an artificial barrier or chemical. It didn't violate the integrity of the act itself. Every individual act remained, in principle, open to life.
But it wasn't just freely available for any couple who wanted to space births.
Oh, absolutely not. It was permitted only for grave reasons. Just wanting a smaller family out of convenience was definitely not considered sufficient.
What exactly qualified as a grave reason under this extremely rigid framework? It sounds like the bar was set very high.
It was set extremely high. The manuals typically spoke of things like serious documented health risks to the mother if she became pregnant again, conditions of extreme debilitating poverty where the family genuinely could not feed or house another child, or perhaps the demonstrable inability to adequately educate or care for existing children due to profound mental or physical hardship in the family.
So not minor inconveniences.
Not at all. And crucially, even when using the rhythm method for these grave reasons, many confessors and moral theologians still worried about the couple developing a contraceptive mentality, that is, the underlying desire to avoid children without sufficient justification. That mentality itself could be considered sinful.
So the default expectation, the heroic ideal pushed by the church, was always large families.
Always. As many as God sends was the standard exhortation. Accepting children generously was seen as a primary sign of faithfulness to God's plan for marriage.
Okay, this entire system, the roles, the duties, the acceptance of age gaps in specific cases, the rigid sexual morality, it all seems to circle back to the very beginning, to the story of creation itself.
It does.
To understand why the woman was seen as subordinate yet equal, why the man was the head, we have to look at how they interpreted the story of Eve being created from Adam's rib.
Absolutely. That narrative, the origin story from Genesis, was the absolute linchpin used by centuries of theologians to justify their claims about natural law, complementarity, and hierarchy in marriage.
Yeah, the creation of Eve from Adam's rib, or sometimes translated as his side, was never treated as just some poetic flourish in traditional theology. It was consistently interpreted by the church fathers like St. John Chrysostom or St. Ambrose, and later by the scholastics like Thomas Aquinas, as being packed with deep theological symbolism that established the entire framework for understanding man, woman, and marriage.
And what were the two main, seemingly balanced points they drew from the rib story?
Okay, first, it symbolized equality of substance. Eve was made from Adam's own substance, flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone, as Adam exclaims. This was taken to confirm their shared human nature, their equal creation in God's image, and their equal spiritual dignity before God. So no ontological inferiority. Okay, equal substance, but second.
Second, it symbolized ordered partnership. This is where the hierarchy gets cemented in their interpretation. The fathers loved this imagery. They emphasized Eve was taken not from Adam's head, suggesting she wasn't meant to dominate him,
Right.
nor was she taken from his foot, suggesting she wasn't meant to be trampled upon or be his slave.
So where was she taken from?
From his side. And this was interpreted to mean she was created to be his companion, his helpmate, equal in dignity but functionally positioned alongside him, protected by his arm, close to his heart, but still under his headship or authority.
And this specific symbolism was used to ground what they saw as the natural law claims about marriage.
Directly. It was used to argue that the natural law itself dictates that marriage must be exclusive, one man, one woman, permanent until death, and ordered toward this specific kind of complementarity, which included the headship of the husband as the governing principle, modeled on Adam's primacy in creation.
Okay, this leads us then to the specific ideal of theological masculinity within this pre-1958 system. It wasn't just about being male, it was a specific, demanding definition of manhood.
Very demanding. Masculinity was defined primarily by sacrificial service, protection, both physical and spiritual, rational deliberation, ruling passions with reason, and spiritual combat. Men were called to be milites Christi, soldiers of Christ, fighting against sin in themselves and the world.
And it required discipline.
Absolutely. Disciplined self-mastery was key. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, famously defined the vice of effeminacy not as lacking physical strength or having feminine interests, but as an unwillingness to forego immediate pleasure or comfort in order to pursue difficult, arduous, but necessary duties.
Wow, that's a different definition than we use today.
Completely different. The ideal man in this traditional view was the strong, perhaps stoic provider and protector who shouldered the burdens of the world for his family and led them towards God, mastering his own baser instincts.
And his ultimate model was Christ the bridegroom, requiring that sacrificial element in his headship.
Yes, that's the linchpin again. The husband's authority, as we mentioned, was meant to mirror Christ's headship over the church. And how did Christ exercise headship? By giving himself up completely for the church, his bride, on the cross.
So the husband's exercise of authority had to be constantly informed by that same self-sacrificial love.
Exactly. Ensuring it remained rational, ordered toward the good of others, and never slipped into tyranny, selfishness, or abuse. If he failed in the sacrifice, he fundamentally failed the ideal of Christian headship, regardless of his canonical position.
Okay. Conversely, theological femininity was defined primarily by, What? Receptivity, nurture, and the call to motherhood.
Precisely. Femininity was viewed as intrinsically ordered toward creating moral culture within the home, toward nurture, toward receptivity, both to God and to our husband's legitimate authority, and centrally toward the twin vocations of physical motherhood, bearing children, and spiritual motherhood, nurturing faith and virtue in others.
And the pinnacle, the ultimate model for this ideal, was the Virgin Mary, the Marian archetype.
Absolutely. Mary is central because she embodies the ultimate paradox that traditional theology saw as the heart of perfect femininity. She unites virginity, representing total openness and availability only to God, with maternity, representing ultimate fruitfulness and life-giving nurture.
How do they see her power?
They saw her as the perfect model because she demonstrates that receptivity is power, not weakness. Her complete surrender to God's will, her fiat, let it be done unto me, was seen as the most powerful act of human agency in cooperation with divine grace. She embodied the virtues they prized: humility, purity, obedience, patient endurance, silent strength. Her receptivity allowed God to enter the world.
Okay, now we absolutely must address the difficult side, the internal critique of this system, because while the theological ideal, especially the Christ-like headship and Marian receptivity, sounds lofty, the practical reality of living under this rigid structure, as the sources acknowledge, often inflicted real harm, particularly on women.
Yes, the sources we looked at are very clear on this tension. While the theology consistently preached the ontological equality of male and female souls before God,
Right, equal substance from the rib.
that equality was often structurally undermined in practice by a heavy reliance on, frankly, outdated historical philosophy and biology that permeated the culture and even influenced theological application.
Specifically, you mentioned the reliance on Aristotelian biology. What did that philosophy actually say about women, and how did it get used to justify the hierarchy in a non-theological way?
Right, this is crucial context. Aristotelian biology, which was hugely influential for centuries, including on theologians like Aquinas, viewed the woman as essentially a misbegotten or deficient male.
Deficient how?
The idea, based on their understanding of biology, was that the female was formed due to a supposed lack of sufficient vital heat during conception compared to the male. This biological deficiency was thought to imply she was consequently less rational, more governed by emotions and passions, and generally inferior in physical and intellectual perfection compared to the male norm.
Wow. So they use this ancient secular scientific view.
Yes. Theologians and church leaders often implicitly or explicitly use this widely accepted historical, philosophical, and pseudoscientific view to rationalize the social, political, and religious hierarchy. They argued that since the male was naturally more rational and stable, according to Aristotle, he was naturally suited to be the leader, the head, thus justifying the authority structure they found in Scripture.
That context is vital. It means the subordination wasn't just based on interpreting Scripture. It had this seemingly scientific backing in their era, making it much harder to question or challenge from within.
Absolutely. It gave the hierarchy an aura of being grounded in the very nature of things, not just divine decree.
And this rigidity, this blending of theology with outdated science and patriarchal culture, led to some profound negative consequences in practice, even when people were trying to live the system faithfully. The sources cite three key harms.
Right. First, the frequent instrumentalization of the doctrine for male privilege. That is, men using the concept of headship not for sacrificial service, but simply as an excuse for lazy, selfish, or domineering authority, ignoring the Christ-like model.
Okay, misuse of power.
Second, the systemic silencing of legitimate female agency and spiritual witness. Because the wife's role was so strictly defined by domesticity and obedience, her valid insights, her spiritual experiences, or intellectual contributions, or even her legitimate concerns were often dismissed or ignored simply because challenging the husband's decision or the status quo wasn't considered her proper place.
And third, perhaps the most direct harm mentioned, the immense physical and emotional toll placed on mothers due to the expectation of mandated, potentially unlimited childbearing.
This is perhaps the gravest practical harm the sources consistently cite. When the documents and preachers spoke of expecting heroic virtue from mothers, they often meant women were expected, sometimes pressured, to continue bearing children year after year, even when their physical health was severely compromised, when pregnancies posed a direct threat to their lives, or when the family was already overwhelmed.
Because the rule against contraception was absolute.
Exactly. The absolute prohibition on contraception, combined with the duty to render the marriage debt, meant the rigidity of the open-to-life rule often superseded practical, compassionate concern for the mother's actual physical and mental well-being in concrete situations. The system demanded heroism that sometimes led to tragedy.
So the system created a powerful structure. It offered stability, clear roles, a strong sense of purpose, deep faith formation, but its theological and philosophical underpinnings, especially the reliance on Aristotle and the strict enforcement of hierarchy, often allowed for or even resulted in systemic suffering and the suppression of the very spiritual equality it claimed to uphold at the ontological level.
That's a very good summary of the tension, and the acceptance of a potentially massive age gap in the foundational story of Mary and Joseph really only makes sense if you accept this entire totalizing structure, a divinely mandated order where the man is the rational head and the woman is the receptive heart and body, almost irrespective of chronological age or even personal compatibility, because the objective transcendent purpose of the union, procreation, and divine order trumped everything else. Hashtag tight outro. So where does this leave us? What does this all mean at the end of the day? We've traced this question of age gaps from, simple modern statistics and psychological metrics, which tend to prioritize individual equity, compatibility, and consent,
Right.
all the way to this incredibly profound, complex, and demanding ontological doctrine of una caro in traditional Catholicism. And we see that the traditional Catholic model's view on age differences wasn't isolated. It was intrinsically tied to a comprehensive hierarchical system of roles, duties, and sexual ethics, all flowing from a belief in a metaphysical reality of marriage that utterly transcended modern ideas about personal feelings, autonomy, or self-fulfillment.
Yeah, and this system, built on those non-negotiable principles of indissolubility and the primary purpose of procreation, it undeniably produced certain goods, immense stability for many, a clear sense of purpose, strong faith formation within families, undeniable family continuity across generations.
Great.
But as the sources themselves suggest, we absolutely cannot ignore the cost. The system often failed to live up to its own highest ideal of sacrificial Christ-like headship, and that failure often led to the real suppression of female agency, contributed to psychological or emotional damage due to its rigidity, and sometimes resulted in real physical danger for women because of the unyielding mandate for unlimited childbearing.
And I think the traditional Catholic frame, studied carefully, teaches us something really important about the dramatic power of a truly unified worldview. It shows what happens when a system manages to conflate its specific cultural expression, in this case, strict patriarchal roles heavily influenced by outdated philosophy like Aristotle's, with its core, potentially eternal doctrines like indissolubility, fidelity, and the goodness of openness to life.
And the Church itself, after 1958, especially post-Vatican II, had to navigate this very difficult terrain, didn't it?
It did. It carefully tried to shift the emphasis towards genuine mutual love, partnership, equality of dignity, and shared responsibility within marriage, while simultaneously attempting with ongoing debate and difficulty to rigorously maintain those core doctrines about permanence and the rejection of artificial contraception. It's an ongoing tension.
Which leads us, as always, with a provocative thought for you, our listener, to maybe mull over until next time. Consider this. If the traditional Catholic understanding of one flesh was so profound, so complex, so ontologically real in their view that it forbade most forms of human interference, does our contemporary focus on absolute individual autonomy, personal happiness, and emotional fulfillment as the primary measures of marital success risk reducing marriage to essentially just a fluid, easily renegotiated, easily dissolved contractual arrangement? And in doing so, do we risk sacrificing the potential for that deep, transformative, lifelong unity and permanence that the ancients, for all the flaws in their system's application, believed was not only possible but actually essential for both individual human flourishing and the stability of society itself?
Something to chew on.
Definitely something to think about.